Good morning in Mexico and good afternoon in South Africa. My name is Arturo Mendoza. I am the director of the Mexican Studies Center. We are representing the National Autonomous University of Mexico in South Africa, and we are housed at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Welcome everyone to our webinar series, South-South Dialogues. The aim of this webinar is to address existing and emerging challenges relevant to the developing world and to discuss topics of international concern and research from the perspective of the Global South. Today's webinar is Decolonizing Glances in Mexico and South Africa, 500 Years of Invasion and Conquest. We are celebrating a unique moment in the history of Mexico. Today, we are celebrating 200 years of independence from Spain. But in addition to the holiday, this is an opportunity for reflection. 500 years ago, in 1521, the great Aztec Empire fell under the rule of Spain. 500 years after the conquest of Mexico, UNAM organizes a year of activities called Mexico 500, with the aim of reflecting on the event that transformed and shaped the history of what is now Mexico. The colonization process was not exclusive to Mexico and Latin America, but it occurred in most of the countries of the current Global South, such as South Africa, which was colonized in 1652. In this webinar, Dr. Daniel Altbach and Professor Amanda Esterhuysen address current issues that still affect Mexico and South Africa as a result of a long period of colonization and domination. I will explain briefly the format of the webinar. Our guests, I'm going to read our guests' bios and then I will give them the floor so that they can present their ideas on decolonization in Mexico and South Africa. After their presentations, there will be a discussion for them. And then in the meantime, please feel free to use our Facebook to participate with comments, to ask questions to our guests, and then I will pass them along to them. Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Altbach Perez and Professor Amanda Esterhuysen for being here today. Dr. Daniel Altbach is from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Acatlán campus in Mexico. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and a master and a PhD in Mesoamerican studies from UNAM. Lecturer in history at UNAM, Facultad de Estudios Superiores Acatlán. He teaches the courses of Religions of Mesoamerica, Historiography on Mesoamerica, and Discovery and Conquest. His main research topics include the study of Mesoamerican religion and mythology and its transformation during the 16th century, in particular the process of resignation of the pre-colonial deities. He is also interested in the history of anthropology in Mexico and the development and tensions of inter-ethnic relations between the indigenous groups and the nation state in the context of globalization processes. Some of his most remarkable publications include El concepto de Mesoamérica en el estudio de procesos históricos, El debate entre unidad y diversidad, Antecedentes y formación del concepto de Mesoamérica, los primeros debates, and Dioses, humanos y animales en la relación de Michoacán. Professor Amanda Esterhuysen, she is the head of the Origins Center at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. She holds a PhD in archaeology from the University of Wits and teaches courses in historical archaeology. Professor Esterhuysen research interests reside in the recent historical past and in contemporary issues affecting the practice of archaeology. This interest grew from a wide range of practical archaeological experiences encountered whilst working on education and heritage projects, and from her concern that archaeology should contribute towards building a more comprehensive understanding of recent history. I'm sorry, I got lost. Of recent history and the formation of modern identities in South Africa. She co-edited a book in 2008 called 500 Years Rediscovered, Southern African Precedents and Prospects, 500-Year Initiative Conference Proceedings, and more recently has been appointed by the Minister of Basic Education to assist with the rewriting of the school history curriculum. Thank you very much, both of you, Amanda and Daniel. Now I'll give the floor to you, Daniel. Please, if you can share with us your ideas.
Thank you very much, Arturo and Amanda. Nice to meet you. Good morning to everyone in Mexico, and good afternoon in South Africa. I'm going to share my screen. It's random. Okay. Well, I have to say that when I planned this talk, I had something a little different in mind. When Arturo and I spoke, I had in mind to approach to the theme of the conquest and the colonization discourse that surround us from a more external, a more diplomatic point of view. At that moment, 2 or 3 months ago, the news in the TV and in the radio discussed the petition of the Mexican government to the Ethnological Museum in Austria, once more, to bring the plumie of Moctezuma, is that one, for the celebration of the 5th centenary. At the same time, the president of Mexico reavivated an old and downtrodden debate about if the Spaniards must ask for forgiveness to the Mexico. Sorry, if the Spaniards must ask for forgiveness to the Mexico for the violence of the conquest. But the more recent events in Mexico, like the collapse of the roof in the Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan, and the making of a wooden cartoon replica just a few meters from distance to the original, and the most recent controversy generated when the Columbus monument were removed, and in its place was planned to put the sculpture of Tlali. You can see the aura of Tlali behind. And well, Tlali was supposed to be an old Mexica woman, but was planned in a very dark and strange conditions. The fact is that the act of moving the Columbus statue creates a vacuum that moves a lot of possibilities that created once more a public debate about the nationalism and its heritage. Tlali was rejected by many social groups under the argument that was a colonialist figure after all, and that it didn't express the reality, well, it didn't make justice to the indigenous woman in the history of Mexico. And well, yesterday, the government announced that the project of Tlali will be canceled. And well, the most important thing is that the heritage couldn't be studied as a static construction. That could be clearly recognized in the news. The news changed, but the subject remains. And well, I have to say that another point that make that my presentation today change a little the subject was the reading of the Amanda work named the Cinderella Metaphor, South African Archaeology, Still in the Making, from 2012. She takes the metaphor of the Cinderella in the history of recent South Africa history that tries to point that behind the act of forgiveness and reconciliation in the Heritage Act, there lies in the commemorations, underlies deep tensions that may not be solved easily. So the importance of the metaphor as the discourse of the archaeology as Cinderella is that the archaeology and Cinderella, couldn't live happy forever, among other things, because her 2 sisters, Instrumentalia and Neoliberalia. I decided then to turn this talk more into the internal colonialism that surrounds the theme of the conquest in the colonial and modern past, because I think we have our own Cinderella here and its history with the 2 sisters either. I think either that if the talk about something more diplomatic we have big issues with or racism and or nationalism. And I think that the reading of the idea, sorry, of the idea of Cinderella gives us another tool, another way to think our problem with the heritage. No? And then, well, I agree with the idea that the heritage is a convention in a moment of forgiveness and reconciliation and overall that it's not static. It has the ability to hide the cracks and the gaps and the contradiction on their sort of patch. This patch has the function to divert the attention from the contradiction that are beyond the convention of the heritage. And that implies many times that the debate focuses on the tree by ignoring the forest. And the fact is that the discourse of the plants of the park that don't change, that's something that we need to attend. No? And well, we have here the myth of the fight sun, and it's a very important issue in our history, and the great thing that our history is proud of the past history, but it's very uncomfortable with the present indigenous. No, they are poor. They are something that must need modernized. You know, it's a problem. We have a very great past, monumental history, but we don't think that the living indigenous are their descendants. No? And well, I think that the big trouble is that we have myths in our history that remain, that are, how can I say, we have some myths, two myths in particular, the idea of the indigenous thought that the Spaniards were gods, and other that points that the Indians thought that Cortés was the son of the sun. So it's a big trouble because from the beginning those myths seem to make the conquest something automatic, no? Some part of or substance national, no? And well, an example of this bad debates, no, happened a few months ago when some of the most important intellectuals in Mexico enter into a debate about the date of the foundation of Tenochtitlan, because one of the evidence tells that it was founded in 1321. So in 2021, there will be the 700th anniversary of the foundation of the city. The president said that thing in one speech, and it causes big polemics. No? The problem resides that the story of the foundation in 1321 says that it was founded because of eclipse, no? Something magic, something great. The wise men pointed that and criticized that only idea. No, we can't took it seriously that the city was founded because an eclipse. No, that's not part of the human history. No, it has to do with the nationalism and that kind of magic issues. No, but well, the trouble was that the wise men didn't either attend the big issue. No, they criticized it either that they didn't have a solid hypothesis, but they didn't have either another. No, the other alternative tells us that the city was founded in 1325 or 1326, but also it evokes a myth, and it's the myth that Tenochtitlan was founded after the Aztec saw an eagle eating a snake over a nopal. No, I mean, the history hasn't human issues, but magic. No, and well, over this dark and unfaithful myth, we put the start of the history of the Mexicas, one of the most important figures of the nationalism, that was also the civilization who was beaten by the Spaniards almost 200 years later. And the trouble of the mythical thought in the interpretations of the history lies in the fact that the Spaniards say that the Mexican civilization fell because another myth, the myth of the fifth son. You know? And well, we have the same magic structure in the meeting of Moctezuma and Hernán Cortés. The attention of the encouragement focuses on irrelevant aspects, as if the entourage who was with the king didn't let Cortés touch him. You know? I think that it's more important to analyze the idea of the event and the consequences of the dialogue if it happened. This because it's supposed that when Moctezuma heard about the existence of Christ and the Catholic kings, he determined that the Spaniards were the descendants of their ancient gods, of their ancient god Quetzalcoatl, and that's why they were conquered in an easily way. No? They knew the Spaniards were the descendants of their own god, so it will be an easy conquest. And well, I think that the Mexican symbols are beautiful, but also I think that the approachment to the past should not be solved in the field of the supernatural and magical aspects. They sometimes are more a distractor than something good for thinking the problem of the colonialism and its heritage. And well, I think that many of the success of the colonial discourse resides in the fact that supernatural events in the past are easy to be fulfilled with fictional facts, with emotional stuff. No? There is where the instrumentalia of the heritage can be visible as a political project that hides the violence. And well, here we have the Mapa de la Ciudad de México en Tenochtitlan. Is the first map in Europe, and it has a butcher here. No? And we have the Zompantli, a man without head, and that's the image that was proliferated in Europe. No? From the beginning, the indigens were cannibals, were naked, not complete men, no? And this is the place where they born in the universal history, no? And well, another most important event that lies in the same magician stuff was used with the same intention is the episode when Santiago Apostol appears in the sky with Holy Mary to lead the Christian army against the Indians. This image was sealed a few years later when the instrumentalia of the colonial project of New Spain faced new contradictions, in particular when the civilizatory project of the Catholics was pointed for violent and corrupt by the Lutheran Church in the second half of the 16th century. Then the Catholic Empire emphasized that the conquest, and of course its violence, was a plan of God. And that's why Santiago and Holy Mary showed up in the history, in the human history. No? That time, the violence of the conquest and of the civilizatory project was hidden by a new figure from the discovery of America, who was led by the Castilian kings in 1492. Sorry, I forgot to the conquest, who corresponds to the kingdom of Spain of Carlos of Habsburgo, who became the king the same year of the Tenochtitlan fall. That issues made necessary that the Catholic unity was actualized by shifting the royal figures and by reinforcing the unity by adding aspects to the presence of Santiago and Maria in the history. No? And well, the next moment is when the Dominican and Franciscan start to write the history of the conquest and make a history of the violence and the abuses that some Spaniards made over the Indians. But they maintain unaltered the two main events that made the conquest a supernatural project, and the Spanish a project of unity, no? that are the apparition of Santiago and the idea that the Indians thought that the Spanish were the descendants of the god Quetzalcoatl. Well, The paper of Santiago and Maria in this moment tries to conciliate the Catholicism by hiding the violence of the Western colonization, accentuating the tenderness and the innocence of the savages. A new heritage of the past rises right here. No? The chronicles start to talk about the myths, the gods, the rituals that compose the pre-Hispanic society. It's an invention. The most important thing of this Frankenstein in process was the organization of the myth of the fifth son that corroborates that the indigenous of the past and the present were dominated by some kind of ethos who conditionate them to have a cyclic worldview. No? The image also gives us the fiction that the production of knowledge is independent from the colonial violence by emphasizing that through the knowledge, the Indians may be incorporated into the Christian civilization. Also, the knowledge has the function to give to the New Spain identity of its own. That's a perfect word for the instrumentalia. No? And well, here we have the priest and the conquerors making this pact of Christian unity. No? They didn't question the presence of Santiago or the idea that the Indians told the Spaniards were sons of Quetzalcoatl or of the sun, because that helped them to make the unity to face the Lutheran accusation. No? And that's has a lot to do with the unity of the Spanish nation. And well, during this time also, not only the Spaniards, some of the indigenous from old families, the nobleza, the noble indigenous, took those events, the Christian events, as parts of its own history, incorporating them into the providential plan with the intention to maintain their position of privilege in the new order. We can see that in the lienzo of Tlaxcala, where Santiago Apostol kills some Indians. We can see that even in the midst of the operation of across over the Sangerman Hills in Querétaro in 1531. That time Santiago announced to the Ottomans, who were allies of the Christians, that they were touched by God's will, and that helped them to beat another ethnic group, the rebel Chichimecas. You know? And well, the myth of the Quetzalcoatl emerged once more in the process of independence in the late 18th century, no? When the independentists took the idea that Quetzalcoatl was Santo Tomás. The Criollos' bet was to point that if Quetzalcoatl teached the word of God to the ancient Mexicans, the conquest was unnecessary, because Mexico was a nation, a Catholic nation, before the invasion of the Spaniards. So that's why that was their main argument for saying that the independence of Mexico from Spain was necessary. And well, their counterpart, the monarchic project, also projected an image that point that Spain is the metropolis by the image of Guadalupe Tonantzin. That image appeals to the idea that the image condensates the indigenous and Catholic religion synthesized by the institution of the church. And well, the Criollos won the independence, and the next moment comes the next moment of the actualization of the heritage comes with the figure of Benito Juárez, when Mexico draws itself as a modern nation. The great trap of the Juárez figure consists in, well, in the first place, it brings us the fiction that he separated the church from the state, and that's another characteristic of modern nations. No? By the other hand, the idea of he He was a isolated indigenous shepherd who became the president of the nation. Give us the image, the false image of that self-made man. No? If Benito Juarez could be the poorest man and became the president, everybody can do that. No? That also helped to erase the historical asymmetry between mestizos, criollos, and the indigenous people. No? And well, we have to settle that at this point, nobody has really questioned if it was possible that the Indians thought, if it was really possible that the Indians thought that the Spaniards were gods. And it's important to say that in this process of negotiating the heritage, the figure of Quetzalcoatl disappeared because Juarez condensates all the attributes that were needed to point Mexico as an indigenous nation too. And well, then we experienced the birth of the nation in the 19th century under the paradigm of the ancient Mexico, who proclaims the importance of the archaeological monuments, but denies the living Indians. There, in the modern contradiction of the project of citizenship, is where a new lecture of the past confronts the most racist politics of the indigenous of its moment. Then, an institutional orientation marks the spirit of the nationalism by trying to solve if it's possible to be indigenous and modern at the same time. And well, I'm going to go a little forward. And well, in 1992, many sculptures of Colón were destroyed and intervened in the celebration of the 5th centenary of the discovery of America, no? Not only in Mexico, but in entire America Latina. At the same time, the most racist political posture in Spain claimed that because of Cortés and the Catholicism, there is some culture in America. And well, the Mexican politic bet at that time for celebrating the 5th centenary by the harmonic concept of the encounter of two worlds. But the most important thing that I want to expose here is that the debate and the celebration of the 500th of the discovery of America didn't expect what's going to happen 2 years later. On January 1st of 1994, the day when Mexico signed the free trade agreement with Canada and the United States, from the jungle of Chiapas, the poorest state of Mexico, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional raised in arms. They declared the war to the Mexican government. That was something that the celebration of the convention 2 years early wouldn't expect, no? And well, I have to say that we can see how instrumentalia and neoliberalia works together in the process of adapting the discourse of the past with that political project. And well, I'm going to be very synthetic because, well, I think that we need to try to decolonize our thoughts at first time. No, I think, as I said, that the myths are part of the Mexican mythology and its nationalism, but all those myths are profoundly racist. You know, none of the voices of them are expressed. Here we have the picture of Filogon Naxit, who has a discourse who says, we didn't recognize the Spaniards as gods. We never knew that we were conquered. He comes from Oaxaca, you know? And well, we can see that there is another mythology that tries to solve, that tries to think, that helps us to think the Mexican history and its mythology from another point of view. You know? And well, I think that it is possible because of the neoliberalism. You know? We can have a approachment very superficial, very superficial, but we have the opportunity to get some information with them. You know, I remember when Paul Simon or Peter Gabriel Peter Gabriel with the Pico song, no? I'm going to finish right now. He gave us the first image of what South Africa would mean, no? The other cultures. And I think that perhaps if we are sensitive to think in the consequences of the mythology, we may have a better intercultural national substance. No? So, well, I have a little more to say, but I think that I will stop here right now by saying that perhaps we can't escape from mythical explanations, but it is possible that our myths are good, are used to think the world in a better way. Perhaps many of the indigenous myths have a clear point of what instrumentalia and the neoliberia means in their horizon, like Philogonio said. No? Sorry for the the last part, but thank you, Arturo and Amanda. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Please, Amanda. Sorry, you're on mute, Amanda.
Hi, good evening and good morning to everybody. I have to apologize in advance because unfortunately we have dogs in the area that will start barking the minute I start speaking, but hopefully it'll be far into the background. But thank you for this opportunity, and today really I'm just going to talk about a very similar project that came into being some 13, 14 years ago now, where as a group of academics, we too, like UNAM has done, have considered that the last 500 years is quite key in the formation of identities and the politics of South Africa. And yet it probably is one of the poorest in terms of the way in which it's been researched and represented in history in South Africa. And it has been very slow. The changes and the decolonization of the last 500 years has been very, very slow to actually come through into popular ideas of the past. And in terms of actually re-identifying what the past might mean as a South African, it still, I think, hasn't really fully come into being. It hasn't really happened yet. But to just give you a little bit of more background then, in 2007, there was a group of archaeologists and historians who became involved in what we called the 500-year initiative. And it was our aim to decolonize and to invert the old 500-year mindset and to make up for several decades of neglect of certain aspects of the historical and archaeological past. And the most profitable route we felt to achieve this goal was in fact through interdisciplinary research. So it was to try and establish collaborations between historians, oral historians, archaeologists, social anthropologists, and linguists if we could. And we managed to put a fair group together, and we produced that first volume called 500 Years Rediscovered. Now, we chose the title for two real reasons, I guess. The one was because 500 years marked the beginning of European global expansion, and of course, the dominance of Europeans in Southern Africa. But on the other, 500 Years was the title of an edited volume published by C.F.J. Miller, and you can see that one on the right-hand side, of the University of South Africa in 1969. Now, it was written by 12 eminent Afrikaner historians at the height of apartheid. And the book had an entirely white European frame of reference. It made next to no reference to any independent history of African people, and its past of Africans was basically relegated to maybe an afterthought. And Miller wrote that the goal of this publication was to document activities and experiences of the white man over a period of nearly 500 years in South Africa. And Shula Marx, who's a renowned historian, reviewed the book in 1970, and she commented that studying the experiences of white men was a perfectly legitimate undertaking, but for as long as it did not claim to be the history of South Africa. because the last 500 years was a time of immense change. It was enterprise and internal invention amongst South African societies who were caught up in and participating in the politics of the time. The problem was not in the history as it unfolded, but in the way it had been constructed, twisted, and ignored by the likes of historians and archaeologists. Now, the discipline of archaeology and history evolved in South Africa in the 1900s, really. And of course, it had deep European roots. And although South African historians and archaeologists forged their own terminology and of course their own ideas, by and large for historians, and I'm talking about the early historians now, the history of African people was background noise. Something which the historian, for example, F.J. Potgieter described as part of his white settler environment, like the mountains, the grasslands, and the fever. For archaeologists and anthropologists, there was a little bit more of an interest, but it was a fascination which involved unpacking the universal human evolutionary sequence. In other words, the steps and the stages of cultural levels that had led to civilization. Of course, the colonists having already reached that point or breached the point of civilization. These classificatory schemes were based on hierarchies, and they more or less suited the historical and political hegemony of the time. The findings and interpretations were used then to justify the social and economic actions of the colonial states. Anthropologists, mostly working in government service, collected historical data, and they published selections of it in the Department of National Affairs, the ethnological series, which was quite prolific at the time. And these studies were distinguished, but these studies were distinguished and distorted by their own myopias and their biases. And Simon Hall has pointed out and highlighted that Beuys, for example, believed stubbornly, despite the mass of rich oral evidence he collected to the contrary, that the huge stone-walled settlements of Tswana area belonged to pre-Bantu speaking people. They resisted crediting these societies with early urbanization in the interior, particularly if it predated any meaningful interaction with Europeans. And of course, you can see by the right-hand side, I've put up a LiDAR image of Molokwani, which is one of these early Tswana cities that flourished in the 1700s. And slowly but surely, we now, because of LiDAR, we're able to stitch together the extent of these cities. And Karim Sada, who's been working across on the southern side of Johannesburg, has discovered, and I use the word discovered because everybody knew that it was there, but in actual fact, now through the technology, he's able to link all of these huge urban centers together. And this has started a renewed interest in an understanding of the fact that Gauteng was in fact occupied, and the first cities and urbanization occurred well before the arrival of the Europeans. The South African historical landscape of the last 500 years arguably has been divided and compartmentalized into Black and white history. The pre-colonial or the prehistoric and categories like Stone Age and Iron Age characterized the African past, while expansion, progress, and industry has tended to be associated with the arrival of Europeans. And this separation has become so entrenched that South African school children are still taught about South Africa at 1750, independently from colonial expansion after 1750. Unfortunately, this fosters the impression that African history is an ahistorical past. It's a past that coexisted with, but neither had influence on, nor was influenced by colonial developments. It also downplays and ignores in many ways the evidence that South Africa has been part of global expansion for at least 1,200 years. And here I'm going back beyond the mark of our 500-year remit, because there's evidence of societies restructuring and taking advance of the increasing external trade stimulus that occurred from 700, 800 AD. So I'll run through it quickly. We can see evidence of connections to the Middle East through our trade beads from 700 AD, which came from Sohar in the Persian Gulf and seem to have coincided with the Umayyad Caliphate. Then, of course, we get the Arab historian al-Masudi mentioning ivory from Safala at AD 916. Later, we can see that the trade moves with the Fatimid Caliphate to the Red Sea, and then it moves back to the Indo-Pacific from the 10th to the 13th, again, through the trade goods that we can pick up in Southern Africa. We also were acutely aware then that, of course, Islamic Swahili mercantile population began to occupy the East African coast, and they set up trade stations along the coasts, the deltas, the river mouths, and of course, they endure for a fair period of time. And in the interior, we can see we have Mapungubwe, which you may all be familiar with, which comes into being. There's a big center that occurs between 1220 and 1300. The center then moves up towards Great Zimbabwe, and of course, finally moves even further up. And we see these in the ruins and the remains of Southern Africa. People that are trading, are actively trading in glass beads. These are coming in. And of course, Chinese celadon, we also see that the Chinese come into being around the 1500s. There's trade of copper out, of metals out of South Africa and Southern Africa, and of course gold, which everybody is interested, and along that with ivory as well. So in 1497, of course, then, 3 small boats round the Cape of Good Hope, and they belong to the Portuguese, who have been sent to search for a sea route to India. And of course, the rise of the Islamic states had blocked the trading routes across the Middle East between Europe and Asia. And so the European monarchs, depending on the trade, were trying to discover a way to reach India by the sea and find a way of breaking into the Indian trade to obtain the jewels, salt, spices that they so required and desired. In 1497, then Vasco da Gama left Portugal to find a sea route to India. And the Portuguese entered the Indian Ocean trading world with its long-standing network of links from East African coast to Indonesia and on to China. The task of the European merchants was to break these links and establish Portuguese economic and religious dominance. In 1503, the Portuguese began to attack the coastal traders, and they forced Zanzibar to surrender to Portuguese dominance. Now, this happening then caused a whole new set of relations, which had to be set up with the interior in terms of trading. And it didn't happen overnight because the interior seemed to control a lot of their own trade. They were trading out to the coast. It wasn't the coast going into the interior. And the Portuguese actually found this out the hard way and eventually had to force their way into the interior and start interacting with the polities on the interior and break the various trade relations that had been set up earlier. And of course, this was not limited to the Portuguese. The British also were trying to get across and around the Cape and trying to set up early stations in 1613. And in fact, interacting with Kwekwe and taking people up and back to Europe to start this relationship and to try and also break into these various networks. So there was a lot of political interior moving within the century. However, despite this, of course, the Dutch settling and setting up a refreshment station at the Cape in 1652 becomes the focus of South African historical narrative. And for the longest time, it is seen to be the mark of the beginning of history of South Africa. History is seen through the eyes of the European. Now, again, that's not to say that there weren't any African intellectuals who wrote extensively and prolifically in the early 1900s, who captured aspects of African life, of history, and the like. There was Kuneni, there's Fuze, Plaiki, Mofolo, Soga, and many others who have yet probably not even been discovered or published because they were written in vernacular. But what happened is that the Afrikaner nationalists who were trying to fight for identity from the 1920s and build their Afrikaner identity began to create a notion of the Afrikaner folk. And of course, this then developed, or they used their Dutch roots to develop this quite deeply. And after 1948, when the nationalists came to power, these grand narratives became firmly entrenched. And these narratives were really, quite superficial in many respects. but they were about the trials and the tribulations that they suffered at the hands of savage African tribes, and of course at the hands of British imperialists. And of course then how they overcome. Now, you might say, well, how does this then enter into the narrative and become so entrenched? Well, they did it quite thoroughly. And I saw the Mexican examples of statues and how statues, there's debates about Columbus being pulled down. Well, of course, you know, South Africa is having very similar debates, and Kruger, of course, is one of those characters that constantly comes to the fore, and the statue is always seemingly under threat of being removed. And Rhodes, of course, recently was removed. But the way in which these narratives were entrenched were through these nationalist movements, through coins, imprinting of images on coins, through celebrations, yearly celebrations, through monuments that were put up in the landscape. So they became entrenched in the landscape. The Voortrekker monument, which of course encompasses the travails of the Afrikaner, and of course covers the whole narrative around the Battle of Blood River. And the little statue at the top, or the little monument at the top, is about the siege of Makapan, which has a very similar set of tropes, which in fact then also highlights the travails of the Afrikaner and how they then were able to overcome the savages. And that particular narrative of Makapan is in fact embedded at the base of Kruger's statue. And so once again, those kinds of narratives are entrenched over and over again. They find their way into school textbooks. And of course, they were in popular films of the time as well. And so if I just talk briefly about the Makapan incident, which is one that I'm fairly familiar with because I studied the actual cave that the Indabele were placed under siege in, we see that the Afrikaner narrative basically is about treachery and deception. According to the narrative, the Afrikaners, which were then of course Dutch Boers, were called in by the Indabele and they were offered ivory for trade. And while the Dutch Boers were looking at the ivory, they were attacked from behind. And so, of course, they were then murdered. And the narrative around the murder is quite horrific. Apparently, they were taken, they were made sort of, they were sacrificed, their hearts were cut out, and they were put on display. They were still beating before they eventually died. Now, what happened then was, of course, they decided they needed to avenge this. The Indabele knew that this was going to be the case, and they had taken refuge deep within the valley in the northern parts of southern Africa. And they had already prepared a cave for this particular purpose. They had built walls around the front. They had put water and, of course, food inside in order to sustain them, in the hopes, of course, that they wouldn't be discovered. But unfortunately, they were discovered, and they were then placed under siege. And of course, the narrative then goes is how then the savages were brought to book. And in the process, unfortunately, one of the commandos from the Boers was shot. This is Piet Potgieter, after whom the place was then named shortly after that, Potgieter's Rus. And his body was then retrieved by none other than Paul Kruger, who allegedly retrieved the body and of course carried it out. Now, this then is what is imprinted in the base of Paul Kruger's statue and has become part of the popular myths around the heroic forefathers of the Afrikaner, of the Dutch, of the Boers. Now, this omits a whole lot of points. And part of that, of course, is that the Boers weren't on their own. They had Gatla allies who came in with them and gave them the manpower. They also had scalp skits or sharpshooters who came down from the north, from Schoemenstaal, which was the hunting trading post up further north. And of course, they assisted them. They came down with João Albacini, the Portuguese trader. What it also omits to mention is, of course, yes, they did kill many of the Indabele, and they took their women and children as captive afterwards, as well as much of their cattle, which they shared out as the spoils of war. But what they don't mention is that shortly after that, and by 1866, the Schoemenstaal trading post had been sacked by the Venda, And the people that were still around this Makapan area were so fever-ridden because they had malaria, they actually couldn't even hold fort. More than that, the Ndebele moved up onto the hills. And of course, they stayed up there and they refused to come down. The Boers then tried repeatedly to attack them and repeatedly failed. And eventually that whole northern area was becoming fairly bankrupt. They were running out of money. And at that point, the Ndebele approached Kruger and brokered peace. And one of their criteria was that their women and children needed to be returned. Now, these kinds of elements of the narrative are just not there. The intricacies, the characters, the people just don't seem to play out in these historical narratives. And that is why we felt that it quite urgently needed to be done, that these different sides of the story needed to come out. The heroes on the Ndebele side needed to be spoken about, and their versions of the story need to be put forward. But ironically, and I heard the stories about the impact of religion, many of the tales of the siege of Makapan have actually not focused on this particular event at all. They rather focus on the recovery of the new chief, which is told in the frame of Christian recovery. There is, once they find the person, it's 3 people that identify the new chief. And of course, there's sounds of trumpeting, and they will walk through sort of many biblical kinds of areas in order to retrieve their chief. And so here again, you see the influence of Christianity also in the interior coming through in many of these myths that come out around what happened in this particular area. Now, during the 1960s and 70s, there is an important shift in emphasis. And we find that the English language universities, mostly following on the prior development in universities in the UK and USA, prompted in both instances by the decolonization of various African countries. As this decolonization approached, generations of both Black and white postgraduate students began to explore Africa's past and to search for usable history of the states which were about to be established. This shift was visible first in the West and then in East Africa, and then spilled over into South Africa in the 1970s. And many of the English language universities in South Africa began to mirror this trend and create institutional and an intellectual base for a slowly growing number of academic historians to begin researching, writing on topics and history of South African societies. And these studies in history provided some progressive academics with a means of intellectually challenging some of the main tenets of apartheid and of white domination in a more general fashion. This attracted a cohort of energetic researchers, and the main theme which they took up was the formation of African states in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So that was looking at the Zulu, the Swazi, the Sotho, the Pedi, the Gaza, the Ndebele, and others, and their relations with one another, with the Cape, Natal, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal. Other researchers examined the histories of chiefdoms amongst the Tswana and the Xhosa, and a small number worked on the history of the Kwekwe and the Griqua. By the end of the 1970s, these researchers had brought about a transformation in our academic understanding of the history of Southern Africa from the late 18th century and the 19th century. But this was short-lived. From the early 1980s, there was a new silence that settled over the history of the last 500 years. And these came about by probably 3 intersecting forces. The first, there was a profound mistrust of histories produced by white scholars. And of course, this was brought about by Black consciousness, which did not trust that they weren't trying to create histories to legitimize what was then the homelands or the Bantustans. And the second, of course, was there was a shift amongst the historians towards labor history. And with the collaboration between archaeologists and historians, that seemed to peter out during this period. And this was because archaeologists began to really focus on growing itself as a science rather than as a history. And in the early 1990s, South African politics was dominated by maneuverings that marked the transition from apartheid to constitutional democracy. Among many historians, the expectation was that the establishment of the ANC government in 1994 would be followed by active propagation of African nationalist history. But in fact, this did not happen. There was instead a general turning away from history and throughout South African society. From the mid-1990s, there was a large drop in South African students in universities in the country and in the standing of history as an academic discipline. And in fact, history was dropped from the school curriculum around 2000 in favor of what was then called social sciences, which was a kind of a combination of geography and history. And later it became reincorporated as a subject, but only in the senior years. And of course, then research into the last 500 years virtually came to a standstill. And under the leadership of Thabo Mbeki, there was a push to develop a deeper and more complex understanding of the African past. And he drove the African Renaissance and various legacy projects. But these initiatives also came to an end when his term ended. And many of these projects were considered, I guess, what we would say, part of the neoliberal. It was to develop tourism. It was to bring in the idea that people would come to an African past. They would come to see Africa as their home because of the cradle of humankind, and they would come and recognize the African Renaissance. And a lot of tourism sites were built up, both at Mapungubwe, around Gauteng in the cradle of humankind. Many rock art site museums were established. And in fact, the Origin Center came into being because of this as well. But as I said to you, this then dwindled and passed. And of course, with COVID, a lot of our sites are being closed down. It was from this background that the 500-year group sought to reinvigorate studies of the last 500 years and develop the historical and archaeology interrogation of both materials, oral materials, archaeological sites, and to place communities in a landscape inhabited by diverse populations of differing socio-political characteristics. And although Philip Bonner, one of the leading proponents, passed away in 2017, various lines of study that were set out by this 500-year group have in fact started taking shape and have taken off. People have looked at the early missionary sites. They have started relooking at early farming societies and of course the settlement growth through LIDAR that I mentioned and urbanization that occurred from the 1700s in the interior of Southern Africa. Carolyn Hamilton has probably taken this mandate the furthest. She and her team built the 500-year Archive Research Institute, which is based at the University of Cape Town. And this initiative will allow us to engage with a rich variety of resources pertinent to the last 500 years, and of course, Southern African history. It aims to support historical research into neglected areas and to encourage the digitization and sharing of resources across a network of institutions. These are very, very important initiatives, I think, that are taking place at the moment. Of course, others have taken up the linguistic line and shown that early interactions have been preserved in Afrikaans, in isiXhosa, Zulu, and other South African languages, because words were adapted, merged, or invented in order to foster trade and other interactions. And we at the Origin Center then, we aim to focus on the spaces between the categories that were created and to show that language is not pure, identities are indeed messy, and the paths to understanding the past are entangled and very, very complex. But most of all, we're trying to show that the history of the last 500 years is worth knowing and exploring. Thank you. And
thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you very much for both of you. Well, I'm sure there is lots of questions that you have for each other. There are a couple of questions that I already hand over, like that were for Daniel. There is just a question that is here. But before we address these questions, I would prefer you to interact, and maybe Daniel, you have questions for, well, first, Amanda, maybe you have questions for Daniel and the other way around. So let's start with that, and then we'll move over to questions from the audience.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to ask Daniel, I was, obviously I'm not entirely familiar with the more recent history of how Mexico is rethinking its past. but I was just wondering if you could just give me some more understanding of the politics around, first, the removal of the monuments of Columbus, but then also the debates around Klali and the need, obviously, which is also present in South Africa. We really have very few African female symbols who have come to the forefront of history. And of course, this is something that needs to be looked into. But then why Klali was sort of dismissed? I was quite intrigued by that.
Okay, well, I think that the figure of Klali in particular has the trouble that one of the most important hiatus in the Mexican history are the Olmecs, that it's supposed to be the oldest civilization that was sedentary and produced maize. And in the early 40s, the big heads of stone are Olmecs. And in the early 40s, the idea of that they were the mother of cultures was raised, and the Mexican nationalism had to fight with this idea, because at the end, the Olmecs had the idea that they were agricultura cultivators, and the indigenous people of the 20th century are either cultivators. And that create a static image of the indigenous. That has the problem that in our museums and in our national discourse, they can be modern. They are relegated to the traditional issues. And Klali tried to be some kind of actualization to the idea of the modern culture, but with a speech of the female presence in the history. But the artist is a man, and it has a lot of money, and that was very hard to to conciliate in this issue. So sorry, there was another question, Amanda. I forgot that. Your microphone is closed.
Sorry, I was just the controversy around Klali and to why she was dismissed.
And well, yesterday, the city council said that there will be no Klali, and perhaps there will be a project where the artists are indigenous or women. And I think that the most trouble stuff in this is the vacuum of the space with Colón. I think that it made a lot of speculations, and touched a lot of nerves. It has a lot to do with the climate, with the weathering of the actual government too. And I think that those are the principal reasons, that it doesn't make a homage to the people that seem to do. That will be more or less the.
And in terms of Columbus, are the debates around his statue still ongoing, or is he going to stay?
The statue will be put in another place, in a Polanco Park. Polanco is a place where the rich people lives, so there will be a little hidden from from the accusations. And well, the figure of Christopher Columbus has been all the time negated, exalted. Sometimes they throw the sculptor, sometimes they paint it, sometimes the people say that he was the biggest cosmographer of the 16th century. Sometimes it's a citizen of the world. Sometimes it's a killer. You know, most of the time it's a killer, but he has these other kinds of attributes. No.
Thank you. Daniel, maybe you have a question for Amanda?
Yes, Amanda, I have one question since yesterday when I read your work. I like a lot the idea of the negotiation of the heritage. No, I like a lot the idea that we can respect the history of they live happy ever after when there comes a convention of that kind of issue. That helped me to think that all the time we are negotiating the figures and the content of the figures that we ponderate. In Mexican history, it's easy to make a long history of the indigenous because they have been all the time part of the speech. By saying that they are like animals or by saying that they are innocent people that must be defeated. No? And it happened in the 16th century when the colonial structure of thinking was Catholic, and it happens in the modern times when we are supposed to be secular. And my question is, it seemed to me the idea of the history or the archaeology of South Africa has not a long history dealing with originarious people. You know? I think that it's something more recent, more in the 20th century. No? So I want to ask you if we have a bigger debate, a bigger use of the original people or their symbols in the earlier history. I would like to know that.
Yes, I mean, the archaeology and development of archaeology really is only in, you know, from the 1900s onwards. And initially, though, it does focus on the notion of original people. So a lot of anthropology and archaeology, which was closely linked at one stage, really looked to try and find the roots of origin. And I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Mamdani and people like that, where in fact they say, you know, that actually where people come from and their migrations and movements and things are really largely ignored because everybody wants to know that homogeneous moment. Where was that original person and where did they come from? And I think this was true enough. I think that has been, is very prevalent still. There's this notion of an original people, both going back into the early hominins. So because we have a very long archaeological past, and also then the conflation of the very early human, the very first Homo sapien, of course, being conflated with people that became known as the San, the Bushmen, and of course, the Kwe as well at some particular point in time. And the tragedy, I think, of doing that is that one is that notion of unchanging. So people do not change, they do not really have a history. And secondly is the notion that they were these unified groups, which they never were. They were quite diverse. And of course, they had their own politics and their own histories as well. And I think it's only recently now that people are starting to really unpick these and to start to say, hang on a minute, we are seeing groups of people who call themselves San or call themselves Bushmen or call themselves Kwe, and some who are classified, colored, all coming forward and saying, hang on a minute, we want to be acknowledged and we actually want to have our histories told. And they're doing it through language. They're re-recognizing language now and capturing those old San languages or Bushman languages. They are telling their own histories. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this then plays out. And I think historians are also starting to recognize that these were people that reinvented themselves quite regularly. We talked about, you know, the early Portuguese coming around the Cape and setting up. And I mean, they were doing it for what, 100 years before the Dutch ever arrived. the Kwekwe groups and possibly San and others were continually providing them with some kind of refreshment. They were interacting. Groups in the interior were already trading. We knew they were trading globally to the East Coast. There were no doubt had internal mechanisms for trade and internal interactions as well. And it's these kinds of things that need to start coming to the fore. They need to start becoming more complex. They can't be just simple ideas of people that didn't change and simple ideas of single groups that existed, rather than the fact that there were quite complex and multiple groups that existed at various points in time and were able to change, exchange, learned language. They were the ones speaking Dutch. They were the interlocutors. So it's far more complex than I think that has been allowed to develop. And these are the things that need to start coming out now. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yes, of course. We have something different perhaps in here. That is that I think that our limit between archaeology and history is very marked in the Mexican. It has to do with the fact that we don't have papers in the pre-colonial times, no? So it makes a big difference in the construction of the national discourse that is purely archaeological. Perhaps that's why we privilege the ancient and the old constructions over the living people, no? And it has to do with the archaeology or the history point of view. And thank you, Amanda.
I think we're the same. I think that archaeology has operated quite differently from the history. And so it almost creates a notion of an archaeological past and a historical past. And that unfortunately is still happening at the moment. And those two need to be brought together in order to create a better idea, I think, of a complex, 500 years.
Thank you. If you don't mind, there are very interesting questions that people asked. The first two of them, they were for Daniel, so I sent them to him, but I think you already answered these two questions, so unless you want to expand or elaborate a little bit more. And then I just wrote on the chat, it's like a comment and a question for both of you, and then one specific for Amanda. But it's again about the statues and the monuments. So if you want to also give a little bit of information about that, Amanda, your ideas. Daniel?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the notion of early urbanization in Southern Africa, and of course of early Tswana cities, is trying to make its way into the curriculum. I think it's quite important that South Africans start recognizing that you can see the historic landscape through other means, through means other than, say, for example, the European or the missionary who traveled and saw and described. In actual fact, we have got technologies now which can show you these massive cities, and of course it can show you more or less how they were structured. Yes, I appreciate that the early anthropologists who described them often described through their own terminologies and understandings, and probably placed a lot of their own sort of Roman Greek law on top of the way in which they understood some of this. But I do think that there's a whole lot of work that possibly hasn't been thoroughly looked at yet, which these early anthropologists gathered, and that was from local, people who offered versions of the past. So these are ethnographies that have been gathered, are still often in Tswana or Xhosa or whatever language, and they're kind of just in archives. And I think they need to be looked at, and of course they need to be looked at with a more critical eye. So along with the established anthropologies that were developed, and they are looked at quite critically, I think that these new or different voices need to start coming through and see what they bring to the project as well. The other thing that we're looking at with the new history curriculum is to start introducing South African language to the history curriculum, because it is embedded in the landscape. And of course, it will help then South African children to start recognizing this past. because in many respects, the past has been created as a little bit of a foreign place. I remember working up in Tulumela, which was a 1500 sort of settlement. And when I interviewed some of the elders and I said, okay, well, you know, who was the king and who was the queen? And they said, oh, you white people, you always talks about kings and queens. When you want us to have kings and queens, when you want us to have something less, you call them chiefs. These are hoshi. And that is the word that we use. And I don't know why these words aren't actually put into our history curricula as well, because they make sense to the large portion of our population in a way that they often don't make sense. You know, kings and queens and things like that are quite foreign concepts. So it's to try and change the language and idiom of history, which I also think is quite an important part of rewriting the history curriculum.
Thank you, Amanda. Can I also say something? Like it's very interesting to see that maybe there is not a lot of history in South Africa. In Mexico, we have history since we are in elementary school. It's elementary school, junior high, high school. It's Mexican history, Mexican history, Mexican history. However, my perception is that it doesn't really create this consciousness about the damage and all the inflicted pain to the indigenous communities that we are still living with among them, you know. It's even difficult to learn native languages in Mexico. When I wanted to learn Maya, they say, why? You have to write a letter and give really good excuse of why you want to learn a native language. So it's very interesting that maybe it has been neglected here in South Africa, or it hasn't been addressed. But Daniel, I don't know your opinion about this, but it seems to me that we have all these history courses in Mexico about Mexican history, and still the understanding of these issues is very superficial.
Yes, I agree. I think that the history has something important and important is because it's good for thinking. No, I say that I didn't like the way that the investigators tried the issue of the ephemerides because they are abstract and irrelevant things. No, if the city of Tenochtitlan was founded in 1321 or 1325, it's irrelevant to understand the entire society, no? And I think that precisely because we have history from the elementary to the high school, that our history is, we can't have an approach to the history that make us think. No, we are happy to make the celebration, no? And what then? No, that's very important because okay, we throw Colon and put the most important figure that I don't know, that restituted all the violence. And in 5 years, what? When the new government came on, what? No? And that's why I think that the approachment that we have in the history needs to be for thinking, no? Not for celebrating. It helps us to understand why the world was like that. No? It helps us to understand where we are being profoundly racist. No? And I think that precisely the ephemerides and magic ephemerides don't help us, and our pre-Hispanic history is fulfilled with magic. No? The history of Cortés is magic, it's pure magic. It's very racist and it's very preoccupating to us to think that the indigenous really thought that the Spaniards were gods. That helps us to avoid the violence and to maintain dominated the indigenous for 500 years, no? And it links with the theme of why do we have what do we win if the king of Spain asks for an apology? It's irrelevant if we treat the Indians like we have treated them all the time. No, I think that.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, Amanda, go ahead.
I was just say, I think we're going through a similar set of debates at the moment, rethinking part of the history curriculum is the need to create a history that makes you think, that makes you question, because I think that largely our roads must fall, possibly the fees must fall, all of those kinds of incidences that happened after 2018, 2019. We're really with a kind of impatience because nothing really has changed. And I think we can only get to that change if we actually take some kind of a more inquiry approach and to history and give people the tools to start rethinking and start appreciating a slightly different way of understanding the past.
Thank you. I think this is a very interesting conversation and discussion. We are running out of time, but if you would like to give like some concluding remarks, or if there is anything else that you would like to highlight, I think we will have to have a second edition of this talk. But for the time being, if there is anything else that you would like to share before we close this webinar.
I'd like to just thank you very much for holding this. And I must say, I found it enormously interesting to understand what was going on in terms of Mexican history and understandings and the similarities, I think, between the two countries. At first, when you asked me, I thought, oh, I know Mexico and, as you say, the Olmecs or the Toltecs and Quetzalcoatl and all of these magic, things. And it's interesting to hear from a different perspective and to understand then also some of the politics of the past that still persist in Mexico today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. Daniel?
The same. I really didn't know what to expect by comparing two experiences. So apparently so far away, but they have a lot of and perhaps the colonialist works the same way in the world, no? Perhaps that's one of the most sad things. And they repeat, no, the motives, the in any way, no. I think that was a very rich experience, no, to see those two experiences. And thank you very much. I really enjoyed the article of the Cinderella. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, Amanda. And thank you very much for the audience, the participation, comments, and questions that they also made this discussion and talk very, very enriching. Thank you very much. And until next time, bye.